And that concludes our discussion of configuration in ASP.NET. So what we've learned in this module is that ASP.NET is configured through a collection of web.config files. And this is just a file that contains an XML formatted description of various configuration elements. It is an extensible format. We looked at creating your own custom configuration section handlers to parse your own sections of XML. We talked about various ways of storing static data in your configuration file for retrieval later. And we looked at some newer features in the configuration system. One was the ability to lock down sections from a higher level in the hierarchy, and the other was this new configuration manager class that lets you programmatically modify configuration files if you want to use that feature. We're going to start with the basics of configuration in ASP.NET here. Like most of .NET, ASP.NET is configured in an XML file, and it sits typically at the root of your application, your IIS application, and any elements that you place within this file, the web.config file, will apply to all ASP.NET pages within that application directory. Now we'll talk in a few moments about additional places that you can configure ASP.NET, but this is by far the most common place to do it, just the root of your application. So the format for the file is just an XML format that's shared by many other elements of .NET. You just have a root configuration element, and inside of that you have nested elements which apply to ASP.NET. Most of ASP.NET is configured within the system.web element, as you see here, and there are many sub-elements within there that let you configure various aspects of ASP.NET. One thing that's important to note is that in IIS 6 and earlier, configuration in ASP.NET happens after configuration in IIS has already been applied. And this makes this becomes important when you start talking about things like security, because IIS is going to have first crack at deciding whether someone is a valid user or not, for example, during authentication, before you even get to the ASP.NET configuration settings. Now that changes in IIS 7, and as we'll see, IIS 7 actually shares the same configuration file, whereas in IIS 6 and earlier, the configuration is stored in a separate file. Now, just to show you the basics of configuring an ASP.NET site, what I thought I would do is go into IIS, add a new application, and add a configuration file, all just doing it by hand. Now I'm running in Server 2008 here, which means I'm going to be using IIS 7. So I'm going to bring up the administrative tool for IIS here, and let's go ahead and create a new application under our default website, and I'm just going to call it foo, and I'll put it under the default inetpub www root directory, and let's create another subdirectory within there so we have a unique directory for our application. Okay, so there's my application. Now let's go ahead and just bring up an Explorer window and start making modifications to our application directory. So here we are, and I'm just going to literally create a text file on disk here, and I'm going to call it web.config and go ahead and change the extension. And let's go open this with a text editor and add a new configuration element, which all configuration files start with. And inside of here, we'll add a system.web element, which all ASP.NET configuration settings live within. And inside of here, we can put whatever ASP.NET settings we want to control. So let's try controlling session state. I'm going to set the mode equal to be off, just to disable session state for this application. And that's it. Now we have a configuration file sitting in the root of that application. And I'm going to just add a default.aspx file, so we have something to look at when we go here. And if I go access the site, let's put in some content here, like so. And if I go access the site now, we'll be running in a site that has no session state enabled. Not much visually to see about that, but just so you know, that's the configuration file format, just a text file with XML content inside of it that controls the configuration settings for ASP.NET. While you can certainly edit your configuration files by hand with any text editor, it's probably more often that you are going to want to use a tool to do so, just to make sure that you have the correct syntax and the right element and attribute names and no other issues. And of course, Visual Studio helps you a great deal with that. If you start using Visual Studio to edit your config files, you get IntelliSense and it will make sure you type in the correct thing. What I thought I would do, though, is first show you the administrative tools for configuration that are available that you might find useful to use if you don't have Visual Studio installed on a machine, or if you're just trying to configure an ASP.NET application on directly through IIS. So what I have here, I'm running Windows Server 2003, and I've created the exact same setup that I showed you in the earlier demo in Server 2008. Of course, this is running in IIS 6 instead of 7, and I'll show you the configuration file system in 7 in a moment. But for now, we have the same application, the foo application, and I've got the same configuration file here. If I open this with Notepad, we can see the session state has been disabled for this site. And I just threw in a default .aspx there so we could try testing the site and make sure it was running. But let me go and show you the configuration tool. So if you bring up IIS, in this case IIS 6, and navigate to the application, and IIS 6 calls these virtual directories, although that's somewhat of a misnomer. So here's the application, the foo application. And I'm going to go in here and get the properties. And you'll notice IIS 6 has an ASP.NET tab at the top. And this is the tab that will let you see the settings associated with ASP.NET. And it also gives you a button to bring up the configuration editor down here. So notice this is where you configure which version of ASP.NET you want to run. So we usually want to set that to the latest version. And here's the configuration editor. And what I'll do is drill in here and show you where that session state setting is reflected in this interface. So if we go all the way over to state management, you'll notice the session state mode is set to off, and that's because I changed that configuration file to have that setting. So if we came here and switched it back over to inproc, that will be reflected when we go back and open up the configuration file. Also, there are all these various other things that you can modify with respect to the application, and these all translate to XML elements in the web.config file. One other useful thing to know about this configuration editor is that anytime you see a setting that is in italics, like we have here, this is a configuration element that was inherited from a configuration file above your current level. So you can identify which elements are specific to your application and which elements are actually inherited from other files up in the hierarchy by noticing that they are in italics. So that's configuration in IIS 6. We'll next take a look at configuration in IIS 7. So next we'll take a look at configuration of ASP.NET inside of IIS 7. So the interface is going to change a bit. And the other significant difference is that IIS 7 configuration settings are also going to be shared with ASP.NET. They're both going to be stored in the same file. So I'm back to the sample we looked at earlier. I created that application in IIS just called foo, and I dropped a configuration file in that directory. And if you remember, this has a setting for disabling session state, which I typed in by hand. So let's go and bring up the Internet Information Services Manager. And if we drill into our application, which we should find under the default website, you'll notice all the settings are shown on the front page here. And the settings here for ASP.NET are actually integrated with the settings for IIS, although you see them just separated into these two areas. They're in the same form, the same page for presentation. And that's important to know or to understand, because all these settings will be applied at a peer level, so that if you make configuration setting changes to ASP.NET, those will take place, or those will be applied at the same point in the pipeline for the request that similar settings in IIS would be applied. So let's take a look at the session state settings, which you can see here, and notice there's the indication that my session state is currently disabled because I set it that way in the text file. So just like in IIS 6, you can change the the session state settings just by modifying the interface here, and go ahead and apply the changes. And then all the other settings are similar to the IS6, although the interface has been enhanced a bit, so it's not just a simple dialog box. We actually have editors for the profile settings that we looked at earlier, editings for session state, connection strings, application settings, which we'll take a look at in a few moments. Now, the other thing that's useful to show you is the sharing of the configuration file between IIS and ASP.NET. So let's first go back and take a look at our configuration file now that we made a change to that session state element. Notice it was modified to be in proc, whereas before we had it set to off. If I want to go in here and just suppose as an example I change the name of my main page here to hello.aspx, if I wanted to configure IIS to navigate to that hello page without having to specify it, just making that a default document, I could go into the default document settings here inside of IIS and add a new one. Let's call it hello.aspx. So this will just add it to the list of files that are valid default documents if you happen to include them in your IIS configuration. So let's go try that out now. If I go to the content view and try navigating to this hello.aspx file. Now that, of course, will be an explicit navigation, but let's take off the hello.aspx and see if it picks up the default document setting that we just added for hello. So there, we just navigated to the root of that directory, and it implicitly picks up the hello.aspx. And if you want to see what that looks like, you can see where IIS is going to be adding its settings. It's got its own subsection within the configuration file called system.webserver, and within WebServer we added a new element to the default document list. So as of IIS 7, ASP.NET and IIS settings are all stored inside of the same configuration file, and they're all edited using the same editor via IIS 7. What I just demonstrated was creating a configuration file for ASP.NET and placing it at the root of the application directory. And as I mentioned, that is by far the most common place to deploy a configuration file for ASP.NET. However, there are several other places where you can modify or place configuration files that will affect the running of your application. And even if you don't use these other locations very often, it's important to be aware of them in case you have unexpected configuration settings in your application. So configuration files are applied hierarchically, and it starts at the machine level. So there's a machine level configuration file, there are actually two, which are used to prepare the initial configuration settings for your site, for your application. And then there's a site level. This is one that is often overlooked. At the root of your website, you can also place a configuration file, and it's not too often, not done very often, to be honest with you, just because it's not too often that you want to configure site-wide settings. It's more often you want to do it either for the entire machine or for a specific application. But it is possible. You can place a site-level configuration file. Here again is the most common one, the application level, so that's where you do most of your configuration work. You can also place configuration files within subdirectories. Now there are some constraints as to which settings you can specify in a subdirectory, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. But it's possible to put configuration files within subdirectories of your site. One of the most common applications for that is to specify authorization rules in a subdirectory. And you might do that by deploying a config file there and specifying authorization sections. So again, the way these work is configuration files are applied hierarchically. So any configuration settings that are defined at a lower level will override settings that are defined at a higher level. So we start with the root machine level config files. We go on to the site level config file, if there is one. We go on to the application level config file. And again, we go to a subdirectory config file if there is one. So the end result of hierarchical configuration file application settings is the following. It starts up at the root, which again is in the root directory for Microsoft.NET configuration. We'll take a look at that in a moment. Then your site level, which by default is going to be the inetpub www root directory unless you've created a different site in your machine. and then your application level, so any pages, any config file within your application, and then if you're accessing a subdirectory that also has a config file, that would be applied there. So all these config files are applied, and anyone lower down in the hierarchy can potentially override settings inherited by previous configuration files. Let's take a look at the various configuration files that affect your application. So we've talked about deploying your own configuration file to your application directory, again, the most common thing to do. But let's go and look at the configuration files that we're already inheriting settings from. So if you go into your Windows, Microsoft.NET, Framework, in our case version 2.0 directory, and in there you'll find a config directory with a number of configuration files. Now there are two that are important for you to understand here. One is the root machine.config file. This is going to be used to set up all the initial values, and it's primarily used for setting up something called configuration section handlers, which are classes that actually parse the rest of the configuration file that we'll take a look at in a few moments. And it's rare that you'd actually make modifications to this file, since it's at the very root level and doesn't really contain many settings that you would want to change very often. The one possible exception to that is the connection string that's used for many of the providers, and also perhaps some of the default providers, as you see here, the membership provider and the profile provider are defined here. Those are things you might consider changing. Although you could easily change those in the root web config file as well, so that's probably a better place to go. But anyway, that's a good place to go looking around. Another file that's useful to poke around in is the machine.config.comments file. And this file, let me just get the formatting right. This file not only contains the standard settings that are inside of machine.config, it also has some really nice descriptive comments of many of the elements. So if you ever find yourself short on documentation for a particular element within the configuration file, this is a good place to go look, because it often has these nice descriptive comments with all the default values and the element names and attribute names for each configuration setting. And finally, here's the root configuration file that you're going to inherit from. So the web.config inside of this directory, and this contains all of the default settings for the ASP.NET configuration file elements within your site. Again, it's not too often you want to change things at the machine level. You probably want to do it just in your application, but it is possible. You can absolutely come up here and make modifications that will be reflected across all sites and all applications on your machine. Now, other places you'll find configuration files, as I mentioned, you can place one at the root of your site. So if you go into the default root, which is inetpub www.root, you could actually place a config file here. Now we've got one sitting here because I've done something earlier. So if I open this up, here's our default configuration element, and you could always come in here and add a system.web, like so. And here's a mean trick you can play on a colleague of yours if you want to. You can go place this file in their site level configuration directory and go in and place a pages element and say enable view state equals false. And that will disable all the view state for their entire site, so most of the applications that they have running in that machine. And it'll probably break a lot of their pages, and the reason it's a kind of funny joke is that very few people go looking at the site level configuration file to determine what settings are applied. Of course, we don't want to play this joke on ourselves, so we're going to take that out and keep that for another time. And then, of course, you get to your actual application. So here's your config file within your application. That's going to be applied next, overriding any potential settings that are above you. And again, if you had a subdirectory within here, and you could also place a config file within there. Let's just copy that in. Go in and edit this. And we actually can't make a modification to session state, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute, but you could change many other settings within the subdirectory. So those are the 4 different locations where configuration files are read and will be applied to settings in your ASP.NET applications. I just showed you how it's possible to place configuration files within subdirectories and have those configuration files apply only to pages and directories below that subdirectory. And there's sort of two schools of thought on the best approach for spreading configuration settings across your site in subdirectories. One is to place them into the subdirectory like we described. And the advantage of placing config files within subdirectories is that if you happen to copy that directory to another location or perhaps another project, the configuration settings follow the directory. And that can be a convenient way of grouping all these things together as a single package. However, it can also be a bit tedious to figure out what configuration settings apply to a particular file if you have to go sifting through all the config files in the hierarchical structure of directories above your file. So an alternative to placing configuration files in subdirectories is to use this configuration location element, as you see in the example here. And location lets you do a couple things. One is you can apply it, first of all, instead of having config files in subdirectories, you can just specify the subdirectory as a location in your root config file, and then set a bunch of configuration settings within that location element. Or you can use this to apply just to a single file, as we're doing in the slide here, so that these settings only apply to that one endpoint and not to an entire subdirectory. And that's not something that you can't do with any other mechanism. So if for no other reason, you definitely want to be aware of location for the ability to apply configuration settings to a single location. So let's try using the location element. I'm going to bring up Visual Studio just to help us in the editing process of our configuration files, so we'll get some nice IntelliSense as we start typing on them. And let's go ahead and open up the website that I created in IIS. Notice I'm using the local IIS setting instead of the file system here. That will let me go through IIS, and it will actually show me all the settings that are associated with that particular application. So open up foo, and we'll go ahead and edit the config file. Now what I want to try doing here is, let's suppose we had a file that we wanted to protect access to. So we only wanted authenticated users to access it. So let's try adding a new ASPX file called secret to our site. And this file we want to protect access to. So let's go into our config file, and I'm going to add a new location element. Now location needs to be at the top level below configuration. So don't put it within system.web, for example. So location, specify a path. Now in this case it could be a directory, but in my example here I just want to use that single file name, secret.aspx. And then once you create a location element, it's almost like you have a new configuration file within the existing configuration file. So all of the same settings apply that you had used earlier, but they're scoped within the location element. So I'm just going to copy my system.web, drop it in here, take out session state, and what I want to do is control access to that secret file and deny anonymous users. And we'll talk much more about this, these settings when we get to security, but for now let's just show you an example. So I'm going to specify authorization, and inside of here I'm going to say deny users equals question mark, which refers to anonymous users. So there we go. Anytime anyone tries to access this secret.aspx file, they're going to be prompted to authenticate if they aren't already, depending on the authentication mode. And if they can't provide proper authentication, they'll be denied access to it. So location's a useful element to understand and use. And again, you can either use it against a single file, or you can use it across an entire directory if that makes more sense for you. Now, if you do end up placing configuration files within subdirectories in your site or in your application, there are certain elements that you cannot place in those subdirectories. And they sort of make sense when you think about it, but let's just go through them quickly here. So authentication, you can't change the authentication mode in your site from directory to directory. It has to be set once at the top level application. Session state, you can't change session state attributes, like whether it's in process or out of process, just because you will typically navigate from one page to another, and you need to keep that the same across all the pages. You can't modify trust, the security trust settings, and you can't add or remove modules at that level. Although you won't technically get an error if you do this, but they just will not take effect. So make sure you don't try to include module additions in the subdirectory level. By the way, these all apply not only to subdirectory web.config files, they also apply to location elements. So if inside of a location element that is not the root directory for your application, you try to place one of these elements, you will find a problem as well. Now, fortunately, if you try to do this, let's go ahead and try it. I'm going to go into the web.config file within the subfolder here that I created earlier, and let's try making a modification to session state and set the mode to in proc, or yeah, let's leave it there. And if I try to run this site, notice we get a build error. So Visual Studio actually catches this and says, this section has been registered as an allow definition machine to application. So the scope of that configuration setting is not allowed at the subdirectory level. So it'll flag that for you very quickly, and you'll have to decide where to place that in your application so that it has the meaning you intended. One thing to be aware of if you are making changes to your configuration file, especially on a live server, is that it will cause the application to recycle. So you want to do this very cautiously, especially if you're relying on things like session state or application state or memory in the cache. All that will go away and your application will be relaunched as a new app domain within the process. Now this happens when you change the root configuration file for your application. It does not happen when you make a modification to a subdirectory configuration file. But let me just show you an example. I have a page here I've written just called session page, and this page displays a value through a label, and the value I'm going to show you is the current value in session. Just an example of using session so we can see what happens when the configuration file is modified. So inside of the code behind here, I'm just going in and checking to see if the val is in session, and if it's not, I seed it with a value of 0. If it is, I'm going to increment it and then just set the text of the label on the page to the current value that I have stored in session. So if we go ahead and run this page, we'll see an initial value of 0, and every time I refresh it, we get an incremented value. So just to show you what happens when you modify your config file, if we go into our root configuration file and do something as innocuous as adding a space and then saving the file again, all you need to do is update the timestamp, do a refresh, and notice the application was recycled and our session was reinitialized to the default value. So if you are making modifications to your web.config file in the root of your application, just be aware and be prepared for the fact that your application is going to recycle. Next, we're going to take a look at how you can store your own configuration settings within configuration files. Now, there are actually a number of ways of doing this, and we'll explore each one in turn, and you can sort of decide which one makes most sense for the application that you're building at the time. By far the simplest way to add your own configuration elements to a config file is to use the pre-existing app settings element, and you see that here on the sample. So app settings is a collection of key value pairs, and you can populate it with whatever pair of strings you want to, so you're constrained to storing strings here, obviously. And you can access it programmatically through the configuration manager app settings property, and then you just index it with the key value that you specified in the app settings element. So let's go ahead and try out app settings. I'm going to go into my configuration file here, and notice it's not within system.web. This is actually a more general setting that's useful for .NET. So I'm going to go in here to app settings, and let's do an add and a key equals font and a value equals Helvetica. And let's go ahead and try retrieving that now. So let me go add a new page so we can just start from scratch here. So app settings page. And just to show you that we've retrieved the value, let's put a label on the page and then go into our code behind and retrieve it and place it in the label. So string font val is going to be equal to configuration manager, which is in the system.configuration namespace, .app settings indexed by font, and that should simply return a string which we'll set to the text on our label. So label1.text equals font val. Okay, so off we go. Let's go try running the page. And there's our font retrieved from the application configuration file. So you can place whatever you want to in there. It's often useful to store things that are global to the application that you might want to change on a per configuration or per deployment basis, just by adding additional name value pairs. One of the interesting things about the way ASP.NET configuration files work is they are intrinsically extensible. You can add additional configuration sections, and to do that you just include another configuration section handler, which effectively parses that new configuration section that you define. And we already saw this in an earlier example when we looked at the machine.config file. We noticed at the very top there were a bunch of configuration section handlers laid out, and those were the section handlers that parse the rest of the file. And so the data below needs to match a particular section that is defined by a section handler. So you'll see this in the config file. At the machine config file, you'll see elements like this, where the system.web element is going to be parsed by the compilation configuration handler that is defined in this assembly, or the compilation section is. And then down here, we know that this particular section of the config file is going to be parsed by this particular class. Now, the other place that you can see this very quickly, let's just go back to our running demo machine here, is if I create a brand new application or website. So let's create a new website. In Visual Studio 2008, if you create a standard ASP.NET website, and let me just put this on the file system, notice that it will generate a config file for you, and part of that config file will contain a number of configuration sections at the very top. So here we have the config sections element, and then notice here we have a section group for system.web.extensions, and then a subsection under that called scripting. So they basically added all of the ASP.NET AJAX support into the configuration file that is generated for you by the website template in Visual Studio. And then each of these guys, the script resource handler, the web services handler, the JSON serialization handler, etc., all of these are sections that will be parsed by the respective classes that are associated inside of this section configuration. So that's the configuration file section handler definition and how it sets up the parsing of the rest of the file. What we'll take a look at next is how to create your own configuration sections with your own custom configuration section handlers that parse it. Let's take a look at how to build your own custom configuration section by creating a handler that's going to parse a new section defined, created below. And the way this works is you're going to create a new class that's going to implement the iConfiguration section handler interface. And this interface is a pretty simple one. It just has one method in it called create. And the basic idea is you set up your configuration section and you put the handler at the top and you tell it which section you want to parse. And what ASP.NET will do is create an instance of your configuration section handler and then pass you via this last parameter right here, the XML node. It'll pass you the root element in the XML tree that is associated with your configuration section handler. So it's pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and take a look at an example here. I have in my config file created a subgroup called the Acme group, and then within there I've put another element called Acme with a bunch of sub-elements inside of it. So what I need to do now to make this work properly is create a configuration section handler that will parse this, or parse this rather, element and all of its sub-elements when it gets created. And I've done that already. I have a configuration section handler and I've placed it within the section group. That's how you can create these nestings of additional elements. And the handler is simply called ps.acme config handler. Now, if I had this compiled into a separate assembly, you'd need to use the full 4-part assembly syntax to reference it, or at least the type name, comma, assembly name if you had it deployed in the bin. But since I have mine deployed in my app code directory, simply specifying the type name is sufficient. So let's take a look at this custom configuration section handler right here, the Acme config handler, and it'll give you a sense for what's involved with putting one of these together. So what I've done for convenience is created a class called Acme settings that contains each of those properties that I'm going to extract from the XML as public fields. That'll give me a class to put them into and return an instance of from my create method so that I can access the properties. So let's scroll down here. Here's the implementation of iConfiguration section handler, just the method called create. And again, it passes into us the XML node, which is going to correspond to this node right here. So what I'm going to do is walk through the children of that node and pull out the values of each of the XML elements. So I'm going to iterate across all the child nodes of the Acme element that came in, see which name it is, and if it's one of the names that I'm expecting, I will set the corresponding property or field in this Acme settings class that I created. And then you just return this new class that has all those public fields. So to actually work with this, I have an example here in my custom configuration page where I'm going to go in and retrieve the settings. So here's how you retrieve your custom configuration section. Use the configuration manager get section method and then give it the section you want to retrieve and then tell it what type you expect it to come back as. And I know it's going to be an Acme settings element or type because that's how I defined my custom handler to return this Acme settings class. And once you have that, it should be filled with all the properties that were specified in the config file. So there we go. I'm going to print them out into a label up on the page here. And so the advantage of this over the standard app config section is that the config file looks a bit cleaner and the XML element names actually have meaning as opposed to this simple key value pairs that we showed you earlier in the app settings element. So it makes it look more customized for your application. So let's go ahead and try running this now. And notice I was able to extract all the values that were inside of the config file through the Acme settings element. So that's one approach to creating a custom configuration section handler. While we're on the topic of custom configuration section handlers, I thought I'd show you one that you might find quite useful. In fact, in my own applications, I rarely find I need to implement my own configuration section handler class anymore because I much more often will just use this one that's pre-built. And this is based on another class called the XML serializer, which has the unique ability to take an instance of a .NET class and serialize it into an XML format. And so what this class does, and this was written by a colleague of mine, Craig Andera. He has a post on his blog describing more details about it. But what this class does is implement the iConfiguration section handler interface once for you, and you can just leverage the XML serialization to create arbitrary sections in your configuration files and just let the XML serializer do the work of mapping back and forth between XML and the .NET types that you create. So I won't bother going through all the details of this handler, but you can see it's not too comprehensive. It just goes through and uses this XML serializer and parses the content of the class of the configuration section. So how do you work with this thing? Well, you go into your config file and you create a new section in your config sections and give it whatever name you want. It needs to match the name you expect to use. And then instead of specifying your own custom type, you specify this XML serializer section handler. And you can do this for as many sections as you want to. And then what you do is create your section handler here, but in that handler you need to tell it what type it's expecting to serialize these properties into and out of. And the one thing you'll have to do is define this type. And I have an example of that right here, PS custom settings. And I've just defined this with 5 public values, very similar to the Acme settings I showed you earlier. If you want to, you can make this more complex. You can use the XML serialization attributes to control how properties are sent back and forth. But in my experience, just creating a simple class with a bunch of public fields works great, and there's not much reason to go beyond that. So anyway, here's an example of retrieving the data once you have those in place. So I go grab my custom settings element here, by using the configuration manager get section like we did before, cast the results to the custom settings class, which I had defined in this PS namespace, and then you can access the all the properties, and they should all be in place as expected. So if we go ahead and run this, notice we pulled out the green value here. I'm also using app settings on the same page, just so you can see a contrast in the two styles. Anyway, that's a great way to add a custom configuration section to your config file, just by plugging in this class that is defined once and is very reusable. One of the things that can be frustrating with ASP.NET configuration is the fact that it's so easy to make changes to the configuration settings, and usually that's a good thing because it's easy for you, the developer, to make modifications and try them out and experiment with how things work. But there are occasions where you want to enforce certain settings. So imagine a hosted environment, for example, where you have multiple applications on the machine, and you want to make sure that all the applications of that machine are using the same authentication mechanism, or none of them are using session state or something like that. So in version ASP.NET 2, version 2 of ASP.NET, they introduced the ability to lock down configuration settings at a higher level in the configuration hierarchy. So the way this works is you add a location element into your configuration file. And again, this would probably be the machine level or perhaps the site level. So you're going to apply this to a bunch of applications below you. And what you can do is specify the name of the application. That's the same as the name of the application in IIS. And then disallow certain attributes from being changed by specifying allow override equal to false. And then any elements that you set inside of this location element will be restricted so that the application 1 in this case, app 1, will not be able to make any modifications to it. And if app 1 inadvertently includes a session state element as part of its configuration file, while normally legal, it would actually violate the lockdown here, so that will throw an exception. So keep that in mind if you ever find the need to want to enforce that certain settings stay the way you set them at a higher level. The final feature I want to touch on with respect to configuration in ASP.NET is the Web Configuration Manager class, which is a class that lets you programmatically modify elements within the configuration file. Now, let me just warn you, first of all, that this is not something you want to do in your application generally, right? And we've already shown that anytime you modify the configuration file, it's going to recycle the application. So you're asking for trouble if you do this in any common scenario. But you might consider doing it for a special administrative page if you want to make configuration file changes that only happen occasionally, and you put lots of warning on the page telling the user that this is going to recycle the app. Then you might consider doing something like this. So here's how it works. And let me also point out that there's nothing stopping you from just writing any program that parses the XML yourself. In fact, that's what people have traditionally done prior to the release of this configuration manager class. So with this class, all you need to do is point it to the configuration file you want to edit. So go retrieve the path for your config file if you're inside of your web app, and that will return a configuration element for you if you call open web configuration. And then from there, you can reach into the config file and you'll see a bunch of strongly typed accessors to the various configuration elements that are defined in there. For example, the app settings you can access in this way and pull out a corresponding element, which you could then make modifications to. And after making modifications to elements within the configuration settings, if you call save, that will flush your changes back out to disk and write the new version of the configuration file. So let me show you an example of doing this. And again, keep in mind, this is something you want to do only on an admin type of page that the user is very aware is going to recycle the application. So what I've done here is, if you recall, in our config file, we had a font element in the app settings, and I'm just going to give the administrator a way to change that font value. Again, there are many other ways of doing this. If you end up changing this very often, it's probably something you would not want to store in your config file, but this is just a simple example to show you. So here's the code. I'm going to let the administrator change it by pushing on a button here and typing in a new value for the font. And if you look at our code behind here, that code right here looks pretty much the same as you saw on the slide. When the user first loads the page, I'm going to go retrieve the current value for the font from the app settings element. And then if he ever calls that, pushes that font button, I'm going to go out using the web configuration manager, modify the font element to have the new value that was typed into the text box, and call save. So let's try making a call to this. Notice it retrieved the current value, which was Helvetica. Let's change it to Consoles and call set font. Okay, and that should have modified the config file. Let's just verify that. Open the config, and there it is, changed value. So the one other thing to keep in mind here is if you're building a page that does modify the config file, you'll need to make sure that the process that is running your web application has privileges to make modifications to that file. And the default network service identity, which IIS runs under, will not have the privileges to make modifications to that file. So you'll have to grant it permission to make changes to that file for this technique to work. Hi, this is Fritz Onion with Pluralsight, and in this module we're going to be taking a look at configuration in ASP.NET. Specifically, we're going to look at the configuration file format and how you add and remove elements that affect your ASP.NET applications. We'll talk about the hierarchical application of configuration files and the various places that you can put configuration files and how they impact each other. And then we'll look at some features that you might want to use as you're building your applications, specifically around configuration data. So we'll look at various ways of incorporating your own custom data into the configuration file, starting off with a very simple way of using the app settings element, and then looking at more comprehensive ways of ranging all the way to custom configuration section handlers. Then we'll talk about some of the newer features of the configuration system that were introduced in ASP.NET. One is the ability to lock down configuration settings. One of the potential drawbacks of the XML configuration file format that .NET in general uses, and in this case ASP.NET, is that it creates a very open configuration system. So it's quite easy for anyone with access to the file system to make modifications to those configuration settings. So this was addressed somewhat in the version 2 release with the ability to control who is allowed to modify which elements, depending on which ones you decide to configure. And then we'll finish up with a look at how to modify the configuration files in ASP.NET programmatically. If you want to build yourself a little admin page or some other utility that modifies configuration settings, it's quite easy to do.